Delia Harmon spent 47 years building a life inside a house that was never going to be hers to keep. She cooked in that kitchen, raised her stepchildren in those rooms, buried her husband from that front porch, and 3 weeks later, opened a letter that told her she had 30 days to leave. She left. She drove 4 hours east with 2 suitcases in the name of the county she had not visited in over 2 decades, looking for a property her father had left her that she had never once thought to use. What she found when she got there changed everything, because her father, Chester Pruitt, had spent the last years of his life making sure that when this day came, and he believed it would come, his daughter would not be left with nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had come on a Tuesday. Delia remembered the day, specifically because she had been sorting through Gordon's winter coats that morning, deciding what to keep and what to give away, and she had been doing it slowly, the way you do things when there is no pressure to do them fast, when the weight of a task is emotional rather than practical. Gordon Harmon had died on a Thursday in late September, a heart attack in the driveway, fast and without warning, and the 3 weeks since had been the particular kind of quiet that follows the removal of a person who had occupied a great deal of space in a house for a very long time. She had heard the mail slot. She had not rushed to check it. She was holding one of his flannel shirts, a gray one with a small tear at the left cuff that she had been meaning to mend for 2 winters, and she folded it carefully and set it in the keep pile and went to the front hallway. There were 3 envelopes. 2 were sympathy cards, handwritten addresses she recognized. The 3rd was from an attorney's office in Charlotte. She opened it standing in the hallway in her socks, with the afternoon light coming through the narrow window beside the door. The letter was 4 paragraphs. She read all 4 twice. The house at 14, Birchwood Lane, Caldwell, North Carolina, had been the sole property of Gordon Harmon at the time of his death. Under the terms of his will, which had been updated 14 months prior, the property transferred in full to his son, Trent Harmon. As the surviving spouse, Delia was entitled to a period of 30 days to vacate and collect her personal belongings. The attorney's office was available to answer questions Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. She put the letter back in the envelope. She put the envelope on the kitchen counter. She went back to the bedroom and stood in front of the open closet and looked at the row of Gordon's shirts without touching any of them for a while. 47 years. That was the number that kept arriving, not with drama, just with the flat accuracy of a fact she couldn't set aside. She had moved into this house at 23, a year after she married Gordon, and she had been here since. She had painted every room at least twice. She had replaced the kitchen floor in 1998 when the old linoleum finally gave up. She had planted the rose bushes along the south fence in 2003 and tended them every spring and cut them back every fall without missing a single year. She had lived in this house longer than she had lived anywhere else, longer than she had lived in her parents' home, longer than anything. Trent Harmon was Gordon's son from his first marriage. He was 51 years old and lived in Charlotte, 40 minutes away, and he had visited the house perhaps a dozen times in the years Delia had known him, always briefly, always with the particular quality of someone fulfilling an obligation. She had cooked for him at holidays. She had sent cards for his birthday and his children's birthdays. She had never had any reason to believe that he disliked her, exactly. She had simply understood, over many years and without anyone saying it directly, that she occupied a category in his mind that was adjacent to family without quite being it. She thought about calling him. She stood in the kitchen with her phone in her hand and thought about what she would say and what he would say and where the conversation could possibly go, and she put the phone down without dialing. She looked at the rose bushes for a long time. Then she went to the bedroom closet, to the shelf where she kept the box with her personal documents, and she found the folder, and she found the deed, and she read it standing next to the closet with the box still open on the shelf. Delia May Pruitt Harmon. Her name only. The address was a rural route number in Barton County, Tennessee, a number she had to think for a moment to place, and then it came back. The gravel road off County Road 7. The one with the limestone marker at the turnoff. The one that ran along the ridge above Heron Lake for about a mile before the property began. Her father's house. her house now, technically, and had been for 11 years, and she had never once driven out to see it. She put the deed in her bag. She put the bag by the front door. She went back to the kitchen and finished her tea and washed the cup and set it on the drying rack. And then she sat down at the table with a notepad and wrote a list of what needed to happen before she could leave. Attorney, she wrote at the top. Then, bank account, mail forwarding, personal documents, photographs. She wrote the list in a methodical order of someone who understands that large and terrible things become manageable when you break them into their component parts and address them one at a time. She had learned this from her father. It was possibly the most useful thing he had ever taught her, and he had taught it without saying a word about it, simply by doing it himself, every time, for as long as she could remember. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the first week after Gordon died. In the private way, she had always handled difficult things, alone and without performance. What she felt now was different. It was something more like the specific clarity that comes when a situation has been decided for you, and all that remains is the response. The response she had already begun to understand was going to take her to Tennessee. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The appointment was Friday morning. Delia drove to Hickory with the folder on the passenger seat and spent an hour in Willa Crane's office going through the documents page by page. The will had been updated in August of the previous year, Willa confirmed, 14 months before Gordon's death. The previous version, which Willa's office obtained from the attorney who had drafted the original, had left the property jointly to Gordon's estate with Delia named as the surviving beneficiary. The updated version removed her entirely. 14 months, Delia said. Willa nodded. She was making notes. She did not offer an opinion on what that meant. She didn't need to. They talked for another 30 minutes about the 30-day timeline, about what Delia's options were, about the Tennessee property, and what bearing it had on any of this. Willa asked several questions about Chester's estate and the deed, and whether there had been any prior conversations about the property's value or its future. Delia answered each one carefully and completely. When they were done, Willa closed her notepad and looked at her directly. You should go to Tennessee, she said. Not because it changes anything here, but because you need somewhere to go, and it's yours, and you should see what you have before you decide anything else. That was already the plan, Delia said. She drove back to Caldwell and spent the rest of the week doing what needed to be done. She was thorough about it. She took her time with the things that deserved time and moved quickly through the things that did not. She packed what was hers with the clear eye of someone who has had to think carefully about what actually belongs to them and what belongs to the life they are leaving behind. The photographs came. Her mother's quilt came. The cedar box with her father's letters came. The rose bushes stayed. She had planted them, but they were in the ground now, and she was not the kind of person who digs up what she has planted and carries it away. On a Friday morning, 31 days after Gordon died and 2 days inside the deadline, she loaded her car, locked the front door, and put the key in the mailbox for Trent's attorney as instructed. She did not leave a note. She had said everything she needed to say in the documents Willa had filed, and she was not in the habit of saying things twice. She pulled out of the driveway at 7 in the morning with the sun coming up behind the ridge, and the car pointed west toward Tennessee, and she did not look back at the house as she turned onto Birchwood Lane. Not because she was not sad. She was. But she had always understood that there's a time for grief and a time for the work that comes after it, and she was already in the second of those two places. 4 hours ahead of her, on a gravel road off County Road 7 in Barton County, Tennessee, a house was sitting on a ridge above Heron Lake waiting for someone to open it. It had been waiting for 11 years. It could wait a few more hours. Delia had not thought of herself as someone with a history worth accounting for. That was not modesty. It was simply the habit of a woman who had spent most of her adult life attending to the present tense, to what needed doing today, this week, this season, and had never had much occasion to stand back and look at the full shape of things from a distance. She was thinking about it now, though, somewhere on Interstate 40 west of Morganton with the mountains opening up ahead of her and 4 hours of driving left to do. There was nothing else to occupy the mind on a long highway in the early morning except the road, and whatever the road gave you room to think about. and what it gave her was the past. She had grown up in Barton County. That was where Chester and her mother Louise had raised her, in the same house she was now driving toward on the ridge above Heron Lake where the Pruitt family had lived for 2 generations before her. Chester had been born in that county. Louise had come from 2 counties over and had never, in 43 years of marriage, given any indication that she wished she had ended up somewhere else. They had been a quiet household, not unhappy. Quiet in the way that some families are quiet because the people in them are comfortable enough with each other and with themselves that they do not need noise to fill the space. Delia had been their only child. She had grown up with the particular self-sufficiency that comes from being raised by 2 people who expected you to figure things out rather than waiting for someone to figure them out for you. Chester had taught her to read a survey map at 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table on winter evenings with the county plats spread across the oilcloth. Louise had taught her to put up preserves, to keep accounts, to look at a piece of ground and assess what it was good for. Neither of them had been lavish with praise or with worry. They had trusted her, and she had grown into someone who trusted herself, which was perhaps the better gift of the 2. She had met Gordon Harmon at 22, at a church social in Caldwell, where she had gone with a friend who had since moved to Georgia. Gordon was 31, a widower with a 7-year-old boy and the kind of solid, steady manner that she had associated, perhaps too readily, with reliability. He was not an unkind man. She wanted to be fair about that, even now, even with the letter from his attorney sitting in the folder on the back seat. Gordon Harmon had not been cruel to her. He had been something more like insufficient, though she had not used that word during the years she was living it, had not, in fact, found the word until very recently. She had loved him, or had loved the version of him she had understood him to be, which was its own kind of love, even if it was built on incomplete information. She had stepped into his house and his life, and his son's life, and had given all of it the same full attention. She gave everything, and she had not done it reluctantly or with any sense of sacrifice. It had been her choice. She had made it with her eyes open, or as open as they could be at 23, which is to say not entirely open, but open enough that she had no one to blame for the choice itself. What she had not chosen was the update to the will in August, 14 months before Gordon died. That had been done without her knowledge and without any conversation that would have allowed her to ask questions or form an understanding of what was coming. She had been removed from the document as quietly as a line of text is deleted from a page, and she had continued living in that house for 14 months afterward, making meals and tending the garden and managing the household with the same care she had always brought to it, not knowing. That was the part she kept returning to on the highway, not with anger, though the anger was present and she was not pretending otherwise. She kept returning to it because it required her to revise a great many small memories. The weekend, Gordon had gone to Charlotte to see Trent without explanation. The afternoon, she had found him on the phone in the back hallway, and he had wrapped up the call when he heard her coming. The way he had been, in the last year of his life, slightly more solicitous than usual, slightly more careful in his attentions, in the way that people sometimes are when they are managing a situation they have not disclosed. She had read those moments at the time as the ordinary texture of a long marriage. She was reading them differently now. She was not going to spend the drive doing this. She recognized the pattern and knew where it led, which was toward a kind of recalculation that consumed hours and produced nothing useful. What Gordon had done was now a legal matter, and Willa Crane was handling it. What Delia needed to do was focus on what was ahead of her rather than what was behind. She stopped for coffee at a gas station outside Cookeville, stood beside the car in the cool air for a few minutes, and got back on the road. She was making good time. The turnoff for County Road 7 was about 90 minutes ahead, and then the gravel road, and then the ridge, and then whatever was waiting for her at the end of it. She had not told Trent where she was going. She had not told anyone except Willa Crane, who knew for professional reasons, and her neighbor June Aldrich, who knew because June had come over on Wednesday to help her pack the kitchen boxes, and Delia had answered her questions honestly. June had hugged her at the door when she left and had said, without any attempt to make it sound like more than it was, that she hoped Tennessee was good to her. Delia had said she hoped so too. She had meant it in the practical sense, The way you mean things when you're moving through a difficult period and keeping your expectations modest and your plans concrete. She was not arriving in Tennessee with any large hopes. She was arriving with 2 suitcases, a folder of documents, and the key to a house she had not opened in 11 years. That was enough to start with. Chester had always said you only needed enough to start with. The rest you built from there. The gravel road off County Road 7 was exactly where she remembered it. That surprised her. She had half expected the memory to be approximate, the kind of childhood recollection that places things slightly wrong, that misremembers a left turn as a right or a mile as 2. But the limestone marker at the turnoff was still there, leaning a few degrees further than it had been, and the road itself began exactly where it always had, running north along the base of the ridge before climbing. She turned onto it and slowed down. The gravel was loose in places, and the road had developed ruts along the edges where runoff had been cutting at it for years without anyone filling them back in. She kept to the center and drove carefully. The trees on either side were full October color, the maples gone orange and the oaks still holding their darker red, and the light came through them in the particular broken way it does when the sun is at a low autumn angle and the canopy is just beginning to thin. She had not been on this road in 22 years. The last time had been for Chester's funeral, and before that, a Christmas visit sometime in the late 90s when Trent had still been young enough that holiday travel had felt obligatory. She had told herself over the years that the distance was the reason. 4 hours was not an impossible drive, but it was long enough to require planning, and there had always been something more pressing, always a reason to say next spring, next summer, when things settled down. She understood now that things do not settle down. They simply change into a different set of pressures, and if you wait for the settling, you wait indefinitely. The ridge came into view above the tree line as the road began to climb, and then the house appeared at the top of the rise in the way it always had, the first glimpse coming through a gap in the oaks about 200 yards before you reached the clearing. She had forgotten that detail, the way the house showed itself early, a partial view through the trees before the full picture arrived. It came back to her the moment she saw it. She pulled into the flat area beside the old equipment shed, where Chester had always parked, and turned off the engine and sat. The house was standing. She had told herself on the drive that it would be standing, that the man Chester had arranged to maintain it had been doing his job, because the payments from the account had been processing without issue, and there had been no calls to indicate otherwise. Still, there was a difference between knowing a thing and seeing it, and she sat with the seeing for a moment before getting out of the car. It was smaller than memory had made it. This was always true of places you last knew as a child or a young woman. The house was a one-story frame construction with a covered porch across the front and a stone chimney at the east end that Chester's father had built in 1951. The exterior had been painted within the last few years, a gray-white that was close to the original color, but not quite it. The porch railing was new. The roof looked sound from where she stood. The windows were intact, though the glass had the clouded look of surfaces that had not been cleaned in some time. She got out of the car and stood in the clearing for a moment. The air up here was different from the valley, sharper and carrying the particular scent of oak leaves and cold water that she associated with this county, with this specific elevation. Heron Lake was not visible from the clearing. The ridge and the tree line blocked it. But she could hear it, or thought she could, the faint sound of water moving that might have been the lake's outflow creek running along the base of the property's eastern edge. She had swum in that creek as a child. Chester had taught her to catch crawfish in the shallows below the cedar break. She had not thought about that in 30 years, and it arrived now with the specific clarity of things remembered through the senses rather than through deliberate recollection. She walked to the front porch and found the key in her bag. It was on a separate ring from her car keys, a simple brass key with a paper tag attached that she had labeled in her own handwriting 11 years ago at the attorney's office in Tennessee. Pruitt House, Barton Company. The tag had yellowed, and the paper had gone soft at the edges, but the writing was still clear. She tried the lock. It was stiff, the mechanism resistant in the way of locks that have not been turned in a long time. She worked it without forcing, feeling for the point where the mechanism would give, and after a moment it turned and the door opened. The smell of the house came out first. Closed air, old wood, a faint trace of the cedar chips Chester had kept in the closets against moths. She had not smelled that combination in 11 years, and it arrived with more force than she expected. Not unpleasant, simply specific, the way a smell can carry an entire period of life inside it without warning. She stood in the doorway. The front room was dim, the windows too grimy to let in much of the afternoon light, but she could see the shapes of Chester's furniture still in place. The armchair by the window, the bookcase along the north wall, the narrow table beside the door where he had always kept his keys and his reading glasses. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The house was cold and still and completely itself. Whatever she had expected to feel standing in it, she had not expected this, the sense that the house was simply waiting, that it had been doing nothing more complicated than holding its position while she took her time arriving. She set her bag down on the table by the door, on top of Chester's empty glasses case that was still sitting there after 11 years, and she stood in the middle of the front room and looked around at what her father had left her. She spent the first hour going through the house room by room the way her father had always approached an unfamiliar situation, which was to understand it fully before doing anything about it. She did not unpack. She did not try the taps or test the furnace or open the kitchen cabinets. She simply walked through each room slowly and looked at what was there and noted what needed attention and what was sound. The front room was in the best condition. Chester had lived in it the most, and the furniture, though dusty, was solid, the kind of pieces built in the 50s and 60s from actual wood by people who did not expect them to be replaced. The armchair had a worn patch on the right armrest where his elbow had rested for 30 years. The bookcase held his surveying manuals, his county histories, 3 years of a farmer's almanac, and a Bible with a cracked spine that had been his mother's. Everything was exactly where it had always been, arranged with the quiet precision of a man who put things in their place and left them there. The 2 bedrooms were smaller than she remembered. Her old room held a single bed with a bare mattress, a chest of drawers, and a braided rug that Louise had made in the early 80s. The window looked out over the side yard toward the cedar break, and the glass was dirty enough that the view was more impression than detail, the green-gray shapes of the cedars blurred at their edges like a painting left out in the rain. Chester's room held his bed, his dresser, and the small nightstand with the lamp he had read by every evening for as long as she could remember. There was a photograph on the dresser. She picked it up and looked at it. It was a picture of the 3 of them, Chester and Louise and Delia, taken at the lake, summer sometime in the mid-70s when Delia was around 10 years old. She was squinting against the sun. Chester had his hand on her shoulder. Louise was laughing at something outside the frame. She set it back down carefully. The kitchen was the room that had been maintained with the most care. The man Chester had hired, a local named alderman who the attorney had described as reliable, had clearly understood that a kitchen was where a house was most vulnerable to neglect. The pipes were intact. The wood stove had been cleaned, and the firebox was empty but dry. The window above the sink had a small crack in the lower left pane that had been sealed from the outside with clear weather stripping, a practical repair that had held. The counters were dusty but undamaged. The floor, wide plank oak that Chester had refinished himself in 1987, was in better shape than it had any right to be. She stood at the window above the sink and looked out at the back property. The yard ran about 40 feet before the ground began to slope down toward the lake, the descent gradual at first and then steeper as it approached the water. The trees along the slope were bare enough at this point in October that she could see the lake through them, a flat gray-blue in the afternoon light, its surface moving slightly with the wind. Heron Lake. She had not looked at it in over 2 decades, and it was exactly as she remembered it, which meant she had been carrying an accurate picture of it in her memory all this time without knowing it was there. She turned back to the kitchen and began the practical work. She ran the taps and let them run for 2 minutes, and the water came through brown and then clear. She checked the breaker box in the pantry and found the power still connected. Alderman had kept the account active, and the overhead light in the kitchen came on when she flipped the switch. She checked the furnace in the utility room and found it recently serviced. There was a dated tag from 8 months prior, which meant the winter would not be a problem. The house was cold but not damaged. It was dusty but not ruined. It had been waiting in the particular patient way of structures built by people who expected them to outlast their own presence in them, and it had done exactly that. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the table and thought about what she needed to do before nightfall. She had brought food for 2 days, enough to avoid having to drive into town before she had assessed what she was dealing with. She had brought sheets and a pillow. She had brought the box with Chester's letters and her personal documents and the deed. She set the folder with the deed on the kitchen table and opened it and read through the document again. Not because she had forgotten what it said, but because she was here now, and it meant something different to read it here than it had meant to read it in Caldwell. The address matched the property. Her name was on it, her name only. She closed the folder and started making up the bed in her old room. She would begin cleaning in the morning, one room at a time, in order of priority. That was the plan. She had a plan, which meant she had enough. She did not find the deed to the lake house that night. She was not looking for it yet. She had no reason to look for anything beyond what the house openly offered, which was shelter and quiet, and the particular quality of a place that had belonged to someone who had loved her without complication for her entire life. She ate a simple meal at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the last of the light fading over the lake, and thought about Chester eating at this same table for 30 years, looking at this same view, and she felt the shape of his absence the way you feel the absence of things that were so consistently present for so long that their presence became the standard against which everything else was measured. She slept in her old room under her mother's quilt and slept better than she had slept in 3 weeks. She found it on the 3rd day, and she was not looking for it. That was the detail she would return to later when she tried to explain to June Aldrich how it had happened. She had not gone into the kitchen that morning with any intention beyond cleaning the lower cabinets, a task that required nothing more than a bucket of warm water, a cloth, and the kind of patient attention that methodical work demands. She had already done the front room and both bedrooms. The kitchen was next. She was working through the house in order, the way Chester had always worked through things, and the lower cabinets were simply what came after the upper ones. She had been at it for about 40 minutes when she noticed a brick. The kitchen had a chimney breast running along the east wall, shared with the living room fireplace on the other side. Chester's father had built the chimney in 1951 from local limestone, and the kitchen side had always been left exposed, the pale gray stone running floor to ceiling in a rough column about 3 feet wide. As a child, she had pressed her palm against it on cold mornings because the stone held the heat from the living room fire on the other side, and the warmth came through. She was cleaning the cabinet nearest the chimney breast when she noticed that one of the stones, about 2 feet from the floor and slightly to the right of center, sat differently from the ones around it. The difference was small. It was not the kind of thing a person would see unless they were close to it and the light was hitting it at the right angle, which the morning light through the kitchen window was doing at that moment. The mortar around it was a slightly different color from the surrounding joints, newer, applied at a different time, and when she ran her finger along the left edge of it, the stone moved. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the pantry where Chester's toolbox was still sitting on the second shelf, exactly where it had always been, selected a flat screwdriver, and came back to the stone. She worked it the way her father had always worked things that required patience, without forcing, feeling for the points of resistance, and addressing them in sequence. And after several minutes, the stone came free. Behind it was a space in the wall approximately 10 inches deep and 8 inches wide. Inside the space was a metal tin, the kind used for storing documents before fireproof home safes became common, old but intact, its lid fitting tightly enough that the seal had held. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. There was no label on the tin, no name, no marking of any kind on the outside. But she knew, sitting there with the tin in front of her, who had put it there and why. She knew it the way you know things that have the quality of Chester Pruitt's thinking, the same quality as the deed that had left this property in her name alone, the same deliberateness, the same absence of announcement. He had not left a note on the outside, because a note on the outside was visible to anyone. What was inside was for her. She opened it carefully. The lid was tight and took a moment to work free, and then it came open and she looked at what was inside. There were 4 documents. The first was a deed. not the deed to the house she was sitting in, which she already had in her folder on the table. This was a different deed entirely for different property. She read the address twice to be certain she understood it. A parcel of land on the eastern shore of Heron Lake, Barton County, Tennessee, comprising 4 acres including lake frontage and a structure described as a 1-story dwelling with covered porch. The deed was in her name. Delia May Pruitt Harmon, sole owner. It was dated 16 years ago, signed by Chester Pruitt as the transferring party, witnessed and notarized by a Barton County notary whose stamp was still clear. She set it down on the table. She had not known this property existed. She had swum in Heron Lake as a child and walked its shoreline and known it the way you know the geography of the place you grow up, as background, as the world simply being the way it is. She had not known her father owned land on it. She had not known he had transferred that land to her 16 years ago. She had not known any of it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the second document. It was a letter, handwritten, in Chester's careful surveyor's script, dated 3 weeks after the deed transfer. She recognized the handwriting before she read a single word of it, and something in her chest shifted at the sight of it. The particular movement of grief that arrives not when you expect it, but when you encounter something that brings a person back with unexpected force. She read it slowly, all the way through, without stopping. Chester's letter was 4 pages, written on the same yellow legal pad he had used for everything, the lined paper she associated with his kitchen table and his evening work sessions when she was a child. His handwriting was small and even, the handwriting of a man trained to record measurements accurately in field conditions, and it had not changed in the years between her childhood and his death. She could have identified it in a room full of handwriting without hesitation. She read it twice before she allowed herself to stop and absorb what it said. He had begun by explaining the deed. 16 years ago, he had received a phone call from a man who identified himself as representing a land acquisition company operating in Barton County. The man had asked whether Chester would consider selling the lake parcel, which at that time Chester still held in his own name. Chester had declined. The man had called back twice more in the following month, each time with a higher offer, and Chester had declined both times. After the third call, he had made some inquiries of his own, the way a county surveyor with 34 years of experience and a thorough knowledge of local land records would make inquiries, carefully and without drawing attention. What he had found was that the lake parcel was one of several properties on the eastern shore of Heron Lake that the same company had been attempting to acquire over a period of about 18 months. The company was based in Nashville and had no local presence beyond the phone calls. Chester had not been able to determine with certainty what they wanted the land for, but he had noted that the eastern shore of Heron Lake had the deepest water access in the county, that the parcel he owned included the only viable boat launch on that side of the lake, and that 2 of the other properties the company had acquired were directly adjacent to his. He had transferred the deed to Delia's name 2 weeks after the third phone call. He wrote, "I'm not a man given to alarm. I do not believe in borrowing trouble from the future, but I have spent 34 years reading land, and I know when someone else is reading it with an interest they have not disclosed, and I know that the most reliable way to protect a piece of ground is to make certain it belongs clearly and completely to the person you intend to have it." He had not told her at the time because he had not wanted to concern her with something that might come to nothing. He had not wanted to introduce uncertainty into her life on the basis of 3 phone calls from a company that might abandon its plans entirely. He had been a man who did not raise alarms he could not substantiate with facts, and at the time he had only suspicions. But he had kept watching. Over the following years, he had continued to monitor the activity around the lake parcel through the county records, which he had access to and knew how to read, and he had seen enough to confirm that his original instinct had been correct. The company had eventually abandoned its efforts on the eastern shore and shifted its attention elsewhere, but Chester had not considered that a reason to transfer the deed back to his own name. He had considered it a reason to leave things exactly as they were. He wrote, "I have watched you your whole life, and I know what you are capable of. I know you do not always know it yourself, which is the one thing about you I would change if I could. This land is yours. It has been yours for 16 years. Whatever comes, you have this." The letter was signed simply, Dad. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. The light through the window had moved, the morning angle giving way to the flatter light of midday, and the lake was visible through the trees on the slope below the yard, gray-blue and still. She thought about 16 years. The deed had been in her name for 16 years while she had been living in Caldwell, tending Gordon's garden and cooking Gordon's meals and managing Gordon's household with the same care she brought to everything. Not knowing that her father had placed something in her name, had done it quietly and without announcement, had been watching over it from a distance for 16 years while she was occupied elsewhere. She thought about the 3 phone calls from the acquisition company. She thought about Chester declining each one, making his inquiries, reaching his conclusions, acting on them without drama or delay. She picked up the 3rd document. It was a property tax receipt, the most recent one, showing the lake parcel assessed in her name and taxes paid through the current year, paid from the same small account that covered the maintenance on the house. The account Chester had set up before he died and structured to run for 20 years without requiring any action from anyone. She looked at the map for a long time. Then she put all 4 documents back in the tin, placed the tin in her bag beside the folder with the original deed, and picked up her phone and called Willa Crane. "I found something," she said when Willa answered. "I need to tell you what it is." Willa listened without interrupting, the same focused stillness she had brought to their first meeting. When Delia finished, there was a brief pause. "A deeded lake parcel," Willa said. "In your name for 16 years. "Yes." "And a letter from your father explaining the transfer and his reasons for it." "Yes." "Has anyone else seen these documents?" "No," Delia said. "I found them an hour ago." "Good," Willa said. "Don't discuss them with anyone until we've talked properly. Can you come into the office next week?" "I can," Delia said. She hung up and sat at the table and looked out at the lake through the trees. For acres on the eastern shore, a boat launch, a dwelling built on a stone foundation by someone who expected it to last. Her father had known the value of this land when a Nashville company had come calling 16 years ago. He had protected it then and had gone on protecting it in the methodical, unhurried way he did everything, right up to and beyond the end of his life. She thought about what he had written. "I know you do not always know what you are capable of, which is the one thing about you I would change if I could." She was beginning, sitting at his kitchen table in October with the lake visible through the bare trees, to understand what she was capable of. Willa Crane's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Main Street in Hickory that had been a hardware store in a previous life and still had the wide plank floors and tall windows of something built to hold inventory rather than conduct business. Delia had noticed this on her first visit and had found it oddly appropriate, the sense of a space that was still fundamentally practical beneath its professional surface. She drove up from Barton County on a Tuesday morning and arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting area with her bag on her lap and the tin inside it. She had not left the tin at the house. She had not left it anywhere she was not. Since finding it 5 days ago, she had kept it in her bag with the same quiet vigilance she had brought to everything since the letter from Gordon's attorney had arrived, the vigilance of someone who has learned that the things worth protecting require active protection. Willa came out to meet her herself rather than sending the receptionist, which Delia noted as the kind of detail that told you something about a person. They sat across the table from each other, and Delia laid the documents out one by one. The deed, Chester's letter, the tax receipt, the hand-drawn map, in the order she had found them. Willa read each one with the focused attention Delia had come to expect from her, making occasional notes on her pad, without commenting until she had finished all 4. When she set the last document down, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father was a thorough man. He was a county surveyor for 34 years, Delia said. Thoroughness was professional." Willa almost smiled. She looked at the deed again. "The transfer was properly executed," she said. "Witnessed, notarized, dated. There is no legal ambiguity about ownership. This parcel has been yours for 16 years. "I understand that now," Delia said. Willa put her pen down and looked at her directly. "Has Trent Harmon or anyone connected to him made any inquiry about this property or about your father's estate?" "Not to my knowledge. He knew my father existed. I do not believe he knew anything about this land." "That may change," Willa said. Not because you have done anything to bring it to his attention, but because people in the middle of estate proceedings and legal disputes have a way of expanding their searches when they realize the first territory they explored did not contain everything they were looking for. I want you to be prepared for that possibility. Delia nodded. She had already considered it. She drove back to Barton County in the early afternoon, back down County Road 7 and up the gravel road to the ridge, and parked under the old oak at the edge of Chester's property and sat for a moment before going inside. The afternoon light on the lake through the trees was different from the morning light, warmer and more direct, the water catching it in a way that made the surface look almost gold rather than gray-blue. She had been in the house for 6 days now and had fallen into a rhythm that surprised her with its ease. She woke early, made coffee at Chester's stove, and sat at the kitchen table looking out at the back slope and the lake below it for half an hour before beginning the day's work. The rhythm was close to what she imagined Chester's mornings had been, and she did not think that was a coincidence. The house had a shape to it, the shape of the habits of the person who had lived in it for 30 years, and she was settling into that shape the way water settles into a vessel it was poured into, finding the level that was always waiting for it. The restoration was going well. She had located a handyman in town through the county hardware store, a man named Pete Garrow who was 63 and had the unhurried competence of someone who had been fixing things in this county for 40 years and had no interest in cutting corners. He had walked through both properties with her, the house on the ridge and the lake parcel, which she had visited for the first time the day after finding the tin, and he had given her a clear and unsentimental account of what each one needed. The house on the ridge needed the porch re-leveled, 2 sections of roof flashing replaced, and the gutters cleared and resealed. The exterior paint would need attention in the spring. The interior was in better condition than she had expected and required cleaning, refinishing of the kitchen floor, and replacement of the bathroom fixtures, which had not been updated since the 80s. The lake house was a different matter. She had walked down the slope to the eastern shore on a gray morning 4 days after her arrival and found it at the end of a narrow path through the cedars that she would not have located without the map Chester had drawn. It was a 3-room structure on a stone foundation, sided with vertical board and batten that had weathered to a deep silver gray, with a covered porch facing the water. The foundation was sound. The roof needed full replacement. 2 of the porch boards had rotted through and would need to come up. The interior had not been occupied in at least 15 years and showed it, but the bones, as Pete Garrow had said standing in the front room with his arms crossed, were as good as anything he had seen built in this county. It was smaller than she had imagined from Chester's map. It was also, standing on the porch with the lake 20 feet away and the herons that gave the lake its name moving in the shallows along the far shore, one of the most quietly beautiful places she had ever stood. She had allowed herself to feel that for a moment. Then she had pulled out her notebook and begun the list. Trent arrived on a Saturday morning in late November, 6 weeks after Delia had driven up the gravel road for the first time. She saw the car from the kitchen window, a silver sedan with a rental company sticker on the bumper, moving slowly up the ridge road as though the driver was not entirely certain he had the right place. She had been expecting him. Not that specific Saturday, not that specific hour, but she had known he would come. Willa had told her to expect it, and Delia had understood from the moment she found the tin that the existence of the lake parcel, once it became known, would bring Trent Harmon to her door the same way the scent of something valuable always brings the people who believe they have a claim on it. She set down her coffee cup and went to the front door and stepped out onto the porch before he reached the steps. He looked diminished. That was the word that came to her, the same word she imagined any woman in her position might reach for when she saw the man who had evicted her standing in a place where she held all the ground. Not diminished by age, he was 51 and in reasonable health, but diminished by circumstance, by the particular shrinkage that happens to people when the confidence they carry turns out to have been borrowed from a position they no longer occupy. He had driven 4 hours in a rental car to find her in her dead father's house on a ridge above a lake he had not known existed until Willa's formal notification had reached his attorney 2 weeks prior. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. "Delia," he said. He took the folder. He opened it and read the first page, which was a summary document Willa had prepared covering the deed transfer 16 years prior. the continuous tax payments in Delia's name, Chester's letter, and the formal assessment Carol had completed the previous week, which placed the lake parcel's value at a figure that had caused Trent's attorney to call Willa's office 3 times in 2 days. He looked up from the folder. "This land has been mine for 16 years, Delia said. Your father knew my father. Whatever conversation they may or may not have had about this property is not in any document and is not relevant to what the record shows. The record shows a legal transfer, properly executed, to me, in my name, 16 years ago. There is no misunderstanding." He looked back at the folder. She watched him read and recognized the specific quality of someone absorbing information that closes a door they had believed was still open. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. He meant the lake parcel. The question had the particular flatness of someone who has finished negotiating and is simply trying to understand the territory. "I'm going to keep it," she said. "The house on the ridge and the parcel on the lake both. My father kept this land in the family for 2 generations. I intend to keep it in the family for at least 1 more. He closed the folder and held it out to her. She took it. "There is nothing here that requires further discussion," she said. "Willa Crane handles anything that requires a response from me. I think you should go." He stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment. He looked at the house, at the porch she had re-leveled, and the roof Pete Garrow had finished 2 weeks prior, and the windows she had cleaned until the glass was clear enough to show the tree line and the sky behind it. He looked at all of it with the expression of someone calculating what something is worth when they have already understood they will not be getting any of it. Then he got back in a rental car and drove down the gravel road and turned on a County Road 7 and was gone. Delia stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded. Then she went back inside and poured herself a second cup of coffee and sat at Chester's kitchen table and looked out at the lake. The restoration of the lake house had been finished the previous week. Pete Garrow and his crew had replaced the roof, pulled up the rotted porch boards and laid new ones, refinished the interior floors, and replaced the 2 windows that had cracked over the years of vacancy. Delia had done the interior painting herself over 3 weekends, working through the small rooms with the same patient attention she had brought to everything since arriving in Barton County. The result was a structure that was not merely repaired but restored in the fuller sense, brought back to what it had always been capable of being by someone who understood what she was doing and why. She had been down to the lake house every morning for the past 2 weeks, walking the slope through the cedars in the early light with her coffee, sitting on the new porch boards and watching the herons move in the shallows along the far shore. The lake in November was a different thing from what it would be in summer, quieter, the water darker, the light on it lower and more direct. She had been learning its November qualities the way you learn the qualities of a place by being present in it without agenda, simply watching. Carol's assessment had confirmed what Willa had suspected when she first saw the deed. The lake parcel, with its frontage and boat launch and the restored dwelling on the stone foundation, was worth considerably more than it would have been 15 years ago, the waterfront property market in this part of Tennessee having shifted substantially in the intervening years. The figure was large enough that when Delia had read it, she had sat with it for a full minute before calling Willa. "He didn't tell me because telling me would have changed things. It would have changed how I thought about my marriage, how I thought about Gordon, how I made decisions for 20 years. He didn't want to do that to me. He just wanted to make sure that when I needed it, it was there." June was quiet for a moment. "That's a particular kind of love," she said. "It is," Delia said. "The kind that does the work without asking for credit. The kind that trusts you to figure out the rest." The lake house was lit from inside that evening, the porch light on, the windows showing warm against the dark slope below. Pete Garrow had installed a timer on the lights the previous week, so the place did not sit in complete darkness when Delia was not in it, and the effect, visible from the Ridge House porch, was of a place that was inhabited, that was being used and cared for, that had come back to life after a long stillness. Delia looked at it for a while. She thought about Chester at this same elevation, looking at this same lake, deciding 16 years ago to transfer a deed without discussion or announcement, to pay taxes on land he had given away, to write a letter and seal it in a tin and place it behind a stone in the kitchen wall of the house he expected his daughter to return to when she was ready. She thought about the word he had used in the letter. Ready. Not if she needed it. When. He had written when she was ready, with the particular confidence of someone who knows the person they are writing to well enough to understand that ready is not a question of if, but of time. She had been ready, it turned out, at 70 years old, on a Tuesday morning in October with a folder from an attorney's office on the passenger seat and 4 hours of highway ahead of her. That was when Ready had arrived, and Chester, 11 years in the ground, had been right about it the way he had been right about most things, quietly and without making a production of it. She was 70 years old, and she was for the first time in as long as she could trace it back, exactly where she was supposed to be. The house on the ridge was hers. The lake house on the eastern shore was hers. The lake itself moved through its seasons outside her window every morning, indifferent and constant and entirely itself, and she was learning to be the same way. Her father had known she would find her way here. He had spent 16 years making sure there was something solid waiting when she did. And every morning when she walked down through the cedars to the lake in the early light, coffee in hand, herons moving in the shallows, the water doing what water does regardless of what happens on the land around it, she felt the specific weight of what Chester Pruitt had left her. Not the land, though the land was real and the lake was real and the documents in her bag were real. What he had left her was the knowledge that someone had seen her clearly, had understood what she might need before she understood herself, and had done the quiet, unglamorous work of making sure it was there. That was what she carried now, down the cedar path every morning and back up every evening, through the Barton County winter and into whatever came after it. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.